Before the first shot was fired at Lexington, before the Continental Army existed as anything more than an idea passed between colonial leaders in desperate letters, there were families. They had surnames already older than the grievance that would make them famous. Names carried across the Atlantic on merchant ships and indentured servant rosters and Quaker meeting-house registers. Names that had been anglicized at port entries and respelled by clerks who had never heard the original tongue spoken aloud. By the time those families took up arms in 1775, their surnames had already survived at least one erasure. What the Revolution did was write those names into a record they could not easily be pulled from, a permanent accounting of who stood and who swore an oath and who bled for something that did not yet legally exist. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. 15 of those surnames are still with you today, and if one of them is yours, the paper trail back to that original oath is shorter than most people ever realize. What the genealogical record shows is that Revolutionary War service was documented with unusual care for an era of incomplete record-keeping. The Daughters of the American Revolution alone has verified more than 300,000 Patriot ancestors through a process that requires primary documentation at each generational link. The pension files held at the National Archives run to thick folders on individual soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, and militiamen who applied for compensation in old age and had to prove in sworn testimony what they had done and where and under whose command they had done it. Those testimonies are the closest thing the archive has to a voice from that time. And they are still there, waiting for whoever carries the right name to come looking. Start with the name Morgan. It comes from the Welsh given name Morcant, which traces to roots meaning sea and circle or completion, and it arrived in America primarily through Welsh migration into Pennsylvania and then down the Great Wagon Road into the Virginia Backcountry. Families carrying the Morgan name appear in the Pennsylvania tax lists and church records of the early 18th century, having crossed from Wales through the ports of Philadelphia and Chester. The Welsh migration into Pennsylvania in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was substantial enough that entire townships in Chester and Montgomery counties were settled predominantly by Welsh Quaker families, and their naming conventions preserved the Old Welsh personal names as surnames across generations. Daniel Morgan is the name the Revolution attached to this bloodline most firmly. Born around 1736 in New Jersey to a family of Welsh origin, he built his reputation long before the war as a rifleman and a teamster on the Virginia frontier. A man who had served in the French and Indian War, survived a flogging by British officers over a disputed order, and carried a personal grievance into the Revolution that matched the political one. He understood the backcountry and the men who lived in it in a way that formally trained officers did not, and Washington used that understanding deliberately. He raised a company of Virginia riflemen in 1775, marched them to Boston in 21 days, which impressed the Continental Army command enough to give him responsibilities that grew with his record. At Cowpens in January of 1781, he commanded one of the most tactically precise American victories of the entire war, drawing the British advance force under Banastre Tarleton into a position where his militia and Continental regulars could destroy it from both sides simultaneously. He placed his least reliable militia in the front rank with explicit instructions to fire twice and then retreat, knowing that a militia retreat looked like a collapse, knowing that Tarleton would order an aggressive pursuit, and knowing that his Continentals waiting behind them would stop that pursuit permanently. The battle lasted less than an hour. Tarleton lost almost his entire force. The Morgan surname in the Pennsylvania and Virginia records of the late 18th century appears in clusters that trace directly to Welsh immigrant families, and the pension files hold applications from Morgan family members who served in the Southern campaigns under his command. Next is the name Clark. It derives from the Latin clericus, meaning a cleric or a learned man, and it passed into English through Norman influence after the conquest of 1066, eventually spreading so widely across the British Isles that by the time of American colonization, it was among the most common names in the emigrant record. By the time of the Revolution, it had spread across every colony, which is both the reason it appears so often in the military record and the reason tracing any specific Clark line requires careful work rather than assumption. The most significant Clark in the Revolutionary Archive west of the Appalachians is George Rogers Clark, who did not fight in the Eastern Theater, but pushed the American territorial claim westward in a campaign that military historians still regard as one of the most logistically improbable of the period. In 1778 and 1779, Clark led a force of Virginia militia through the Illinois country, taking British posts at Kaskaskia and Vincennes in winter conditions that by any conventional military accounting should have stopped them before they started. What he secured with those posts was the Northwest Territory's inclusion in the final peace settlement of 1783, a Clark line with roots in Virginia or Kentucky, especially one that surfaces in the land records of the late 18th century near the Ohio River Valley, may carry a direct thread to that Western campaign. The name Allen comes from a Celtic origin, possibly from the Breton personal name Allen, and it entered the English-speaking world through migration from Brittany with the Norman settlers and through separate Welsh and Scottish lines in the centuries that followed. It was common enough in the colonial record that it appears across every region, but the Vermont connection gives it a specific genealogical signature in the Revolutionary Archive. Ethan Allen is the name the record reaches for immediately, the Vermont militia commander who took Fort Ticonderoga from the British garrison in May of 1775 in a pre-dawn action with fewer than 90 men that caught the post entirely unprepared. Allen had been operating in the disputed Green Mountain region for years before the war, leading an irregular organization that resisted the land claims of New York against the New Hampshire grant settlers, which gave him both a ready-made militia structure and a population of men who were already accustomed to extra-legal action in defense of what they considered their property and their autonomy. The cannon at Ticonderoga mattered more than the fort itself in the immediate military situation, because the Continental Army besieging Boston had almost no artillery. Those guns, hauled across frozen lakes and mountain terrain by Henry Knox over the following months, became the weapons on Dorchester Heights that made the British occupation of Boston untenable. Allen himself was captured later in 1775, attempting to take Montreal in an action that the historians of the campaign describe as poorly coordinated and insufficiently resourced, and he spent nearly 3 years as a British prisoner before being exchanged. The Allen surname in New England is dense in the colonial records, and the Vermont land records carry the family's imprint through the Green Mountain Boys and through the subsequent land grant system that followed Vermont statehood. The surname Washington requires almost no introduction, as a name attached to the Revolution, but its genealogical weight is often misunderstood by those who carry it. It is an English place name, a habitational surname derived from a village in County Durham in the northeast of England, meaning the settlement of Wassa's people, and the family that carried it to Virginia in the mid-17th century arrived as planters of middling status, who rose through land acquisition and strategic marriage. George Washington was the third generation of that line in Virginia. What the genealogical record shows is that the Washington name in America was never common in the way that Smith or Jones was common, and it remains rare today, which means that anyone carrying it with documented colonial Virginia roots has a measurably shorter path to the founding family than bearers of the most common English surnames would have to any comparably prominent ancestor. The Pension Archive contains Washington surnames who served as junior officers and ordinary privates, men not related to the general but carrying a name that had become, by 1776, one the British command knew to take seriously in the field. Marion is the next name on the record, and it carries a particular kind of weight in the southern theater of the war. Francis Marion, whom the British officer Banastre Tarleton called the Swamp Fox in frustration after an unsuccessful pursuit through the low country swamps, conducted a partisan campaign in the South Carolina backcountry that the British command found genuinely difficult to counter through conventional military means. He moved quickly, made use of local geography and waterways his men knew from childhood, relied on intelligence from the civilian population, and refused to engage in the set-piece battles where British regulars held every structural advantage. The Marion surname in South Carolina traces to Huguenot families, French Protestants who fled Catholic France following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and settled extensively in the Carolina Low Country where the colonial government offered them land and religious tolerance. The name itself is French in origin, a diminutive of Marie. If your Marions come through South Carolina with Huguenot church records behind them, the genealogical line to the partisan campaign of 1780 and 1781 is well documented, and the Daughters of the American Revolution files are specific about which Marion family members rendered verifiable service. The name Greene follows, and here the archive is precise in ways that matter for anyone attempting to trace a specific line rather than a general claim to revolutionary association. Nathaniel Greene came from a Quaker family in Potawatomi, Rhode Island, a line that had kept careful meeting records going back several generations before the war, the kind of documentary continuity that the Quaker tradition produced through its disciplined record-keeping of births, marriages, and deaths within the meeting community. He was largely self-educated in military matters, having taught himself from books in what was then a small personal library he had assembled over years, and he had been disowned by his local Quaker meeting for attending a militia muster, which tells you something about both the community and the man. He became the commander Washington trusted most in the South after the catastrophic fall of Charleston in May of 1780, which delivered the entire Continental Army in the South into British hands and left the southern states with almost no organized American military force. Greene took command of the Southern Department in December of 1780 with an army he described in his own letters as too small to fight a battle and too weak to retreat safely. His southern campaign from 1780 to 1781 is studied in military history courses because he understood something that contradicted conventional 18th century military logic. He did not need to win battles to win the campaign. He needed the British to exhaust themselves pursuing him across ground that favored his smaller force, using partisan commanders like Marion and Sumter to harry British supply lines and garrisons while his main force kept moving. The British won most of the pitched battles in the southern campaign. Greene won the campaign. The Rhode Island Quaker meeting records give the Greene genealogy unusual documentary depth, and the migration of Greene families south and west after the war follows a traceable corridor through the land grant records and the early federal census returns. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The surname Knox arrives next, and it is Scottish in origin, a place name from the Scots Gaelic Knock, meaning a rounded hill or knoll, and it arrived in America primarily through Scots-Irish migration through the Ulster Plantation and across the Atlantic to the Mid-Atlantic and New England colonies in the early 18th century. Henry Knox was a Boston bookseller before the war, a young man in his mid-20s who had read everything in his shop about artillery, fortification, and military engineering, and had no practical experience of any of it when Washington gave him the assignment that would define his reputation. In the winter of 1775 and 1776, Washington sent him to retrieve the cannon captured at Ticonderoga and bring them overland to Boston. Knox moved roughly 60 tons of artillery across frozen Lake George, through the Berkshire Hills, and across winter terrain that had no roads adequate to the purpose, arriving at Dorchester Heights with guns that made the British occupation of Boston militarily untenable. The British evacuated in March of 1776. Knox became Washington's chief artillery officer for the remainder of the war and the first United States Secretary of War after it. Knox families in New England, particularly those with Massachusetts colonial roots, appear in the muster rolls and pension files with regularity, and the Scots-Irish origin of the surname makes the migration pattern traceable through the surname distribution records of the colonial period. The name Hale carries the particular gravity of someone who did not survive to file a pension or leave a sworn account of his service. Nathan Hale was a Connecticut schoolteacher and Continental Army captain, a Yale graduate who had been teaching school in New London when the war began and who joined the 7th Connecticut Regiment in the first year of the conflict. He volunteered to cross behind British lines on Long Island in September of 1776 to gather intelligence about British troop dispositions following the American defeat at the Battle of Long Island. He had no training in intelligence work, no cover identity prepared with the care that the task required, and no means of communicating with the American command if he was discovered. He was captured within days, possibly identified by a loyalist relative or acquaintance who recognized him, and executed without trial the following morning at 21 years old. The account of his final statement, that he regretted having only one life to give for his country, comes through a single British officer's account, written down years after the event, which is the reason historians are careful about the exact wording. That he was hanged young, and without the ceremony of a military trial, is documented in the British record. The Hale surname in Connecticut is Old English in origin, from a word meaning a nook or a sheltered corner of land, and it appears in the colonial records of New England going back to the 1600s, tracing to early Puritan migration from the eastern counties of England, where the name was concentrated in the surname distribution of the period. The surname Revere carries a French origin, anglicized from the Huguenot name Rivoire, and its presence in the Boston colonial record is a direct result of the same Huguenot migration that brought the Marion family to South Carolina, the dispersal of French Protestant refugees across the British Atlantic world following 1685. Paul Revere's father, Apollos Rivoire, arrived in Boston from France as a young teenager, apprenticed to a silversmith, and became one himself, eventually anglicizing the family name to something an English-speaking clientele could manage more easily. The son learned the same trade before he became something else entirely in the public memory. The midnight ride of April 18, 1775, was not a solitary event, and the historical record is clear about this, even when the popular memory is not. William Dawes rode a different route simultaneously, and Samuel Prescott, who joined Revere between Lexington and Concord, was the one who completed the ride to Concord after Revere was stopped and briefly detained by a British patrol. The Huguenot Church records in Boston and the Silversmith Guild records of the colonial period give the Revere family's American origins unusual documentary clarity, and a line carrying this surname with pre-revolutionary Boston roots is among the more specifically traceable on this list. The surname Putnam is English in origin, a place name derived from a location in Kent, and it arrived in New England with the great Puritan migration of the 1630s. The Putnam family appears in Salem, Massachusetts, records well before the Revolution, including in the difficult record of the 1692 witchcraft crisis, where family members played prominent roles among the accusers. What the Revolution did was attach a different kind of history to the name. Israel Putnam was the Connecticut militia general, a veteran of the French and Indian War, who was reportedly plowing his field in Pomfret when he heard the news from Lexington and rode to the fighting without stopping to change his clothes or his circumstances. At the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, he commanded among the American positions on the Charlestown Peninsula. The instruction to hold fire until the last possible moment, the particular tactical discipline that made the British assault so costly before the American position finally gave way from lack of ammunition, is associated in various accounts with several commanders present that day, and Putnam's name appears among those to whom the order has been attributed. The Putnam genealogy in New England is dense and well documented from early Puritan records, and the migration corridor south and west after the war is traceable through the land records of the early Republic. The name Stark appears next, and it is one of the clearest cases on this list of a surname attached to a specific battle as its genealogical signature in the Revolutionary Archive. John Stark was a New Hampshire general whose most consequential action came at Bennington in August of 1777, a battle fought in what is now Vermont against a British and Hessian detachment sent to seize supplies and horses for the main British force moving south from Canada. The American victory at Bennington, which Stark commanded on the American side, contributed materially to the isolation of the British force that surrendered at Saratoga 2 months later, the engagement the historical record identifies as the turning point that brought France into the war on the American side. The surname Stark is Germanic in origin, from a word meaning strong, and it arrived in America through German and Scots-Irish migration into New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies. A Stark family with New Hampshire or Vermont roots in the late 18th century has a traceable connection to one of the campaigns the Continental Army's own records identify as critical to the outcome of the Northern Theater. Surname Sumter carries weight in South Carolina beyond the biographical, because the name itself was attached to the geography of later American history in a way that made the Revolutionary connection invisible to most people who encountered it in their school books. Thomas Sumter, called the Gamecock by his militia and eventually by his enemies as well, was a South Carolina partisan leader who operated in much the same terrain as Francis Marion, but with a different temperament, more aggressive in his tactical choices, more willing to accept losses to inflict them, and more difficult for the British command to categorize or predict. He was nearly 60 years old during the height of the partisan campaign in 1780 and 1781, a fact the military record notes without comment. He had served in the French and Indian War, had lived among the Cherokee in the years before the Revolution as a trader, and had some understanding of that community, and had seen his home and farm burned by Loyalist raiders in 1780, which removed any remaining ambivalence he might have had about the personal cost of the conflict. The origin of the Sumter surname is not fully settled in the etymological record, possibly an Anglicization of a name related to the English word Sumter, meaning a pack-horse driver, though the documentary trail for this etymology is not conclusive. What the South Carolina Piedmont records show is a family established in the middle ground between the low country planters and the mountain settlers, drawing on a network of backcountry farmers and militia veterans who had more to lose from British occupation than from the uncertainty of independence. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where Confederate artillery opened fire on a Federal garrison in April of 1861 and began the Civil War, was named for him decades after his death, which is one reason the revolutionary connection to the surname tends to be obscured in how the name appears in American historical memory. The surname Hamilton requires a careful distinction that the archive makes clearly even when popular accounts do not. The name is Scottish in origin, derived from a place in Lanarkshire, and it arrived in America primarily through Scots-Irish migration through Ulster into the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies in the early 18th century. Alexander Hamilton was born in Nevis in the Caribbean, arrived in New York as a young man on the strength of a local fundraising effort that recognized his abilities, became Washington's aide-de-camp and closest staff officer during the war's middle years, commanded a battalion assault at Yorktown in 1781 in the action that sealed the final British surrender, and then built the financial architecture of the new nation as its first Secretary of the Treasury. The Hamilton surname in America is common enough through Scots-Irish migration that carrying it does not establish a specific line without documentary work, but the pension files and the muster rolls are precise about which Hamilton families served in which regiments, and the New York records in particular carry dense clusters of Hamilton service that trace through the Scots-Irish migration corridors. The surname Schuyler stands apart from the rest of this list in origin and in what it represents about who fought the Revolution and from what social position. Philip Schuyler was a wealthy New York landowner, a member of the Dutch Patroon class whose families had held land along the Hudson River since the Dutch colonial period of the 17th century. The surname is Dutch, from a word meaning scholar, and the Schuyler family's presence in the New York colonial records goes back to the period of Dutch governance in New Netherland. As a general in the Continental Army, Schuyler commanded the Northern Department in the early years of the war, managing the logistics of the northern campaigns under conditions of extreme supply difficulty, until political pressure and questions about the fall of Ticonderoga in 1777 led to his replacement by Horatio Gates. His daughter Elizabeth, called Eliza, married Alexander Hamilton in 1780, connecting two of the surnames on this list through one of the most documented marriages in the founding generation. The Dutch Reformed Church records in the Hudson Valley give the Schuyler genealogy unusual depth and continuity because the Dutch colonial community maintained registration practices that the English-speaking settler communities of other regions did not always match. The final surname on this record is Warren, and it closes the list on a note the archive treats with particular care. Joseph Warren was a Boston physician, a Harvard graduate, and a leading member of the Sons of Liberty, the man who organized much of the intelligence network that gave the colonial leadership warning of British military movements in the spring of 1775. He sent both Paul Revere and William Dawes on their rides on the night of April 18th. He was commissioned as a Major General of Massachusetts Militia in June of 1775. He died at Bunker Hill the following day, fighting as a volunteer in the front ranks because he arrived too late to take a formal command position and refused to leave. He was 34 years old. His body was buried on the battlefield and later identified and reburied through the account of Paul Revere, who recognized the dental work he had done for Warren years before. The Warren surname is Norman French in origin, derived from a word related to the enclosure of a game preserve, and it arrived in New England with the early Puritan migration of the 1630s. The Massachusetts colonial records place Warren families across the eastern part of the colony, and the genealogical documentation of the Joseph Warren line is substantial because his prominence in pre-revolutionary Boston produced a paper trail that runs through Harvard records, church records, Sons of Liberty membership, and the official correspondence of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. A Warren family with Massachusetts roots reaching back before 1775 carries a thread to the physician who organized the network and then went to the battle himself. These 15 names do not exhaust the surnames that the Revolutionary record carries with weight. They represent a cross-section of the colonial world that fought Welsh riflemen and Dutch landowners, French Huguenot silversmiths and Scottish booksellers, Connecticut schoolteachers and Rhode Island Quakers, who set aside their pacifist tradition to take a command in a war they had not expected to fight. What the record shows, when you read the pension files and the muster rolls together, is that the Revolution was fought by families from every layer of colonial society and from every part of the Atlantic migration. The surname is the first thread. The document is what confirms it. What the archive holds across all 15 of these surnames is something more specific than legend or inherited pride. The pension files are sworn testimony given to federal commissioners who had reason to demand accuracy. The muster rolls are administrative records kept by officers who needed to know who was present and who was not. The Daughters of the American Revolution verification process, which has been running since 1890, is rigorous enough that a lineage claim that passes it has been cross-checked against primary documents at each generational link. The genealogical record of the Revolution is one of the better documented military archives of the 18th century, precisely because the new nation understood, almost from the beginning, that it needed to know who had been there. The land grants given to veterans, the pension payments administered through the federal government, the state-level records of militia service, all of these created a documentary layer that has survived in considerable quantity. The National Archives holds pension files on roughly 80,000 individual veterans. The compiled service records run to millions of individual documents. If your surname appears on this list and your family's oral history places them in the colonial period, the paper trail may be considerably closer than you think. The census records from 1790, the first federal enumeration, can place a family in a specific county. A pension application, if one exists, can place an individual at a specific engagement. A muster roll can confirm a regiment and the name of the officer who commanded it. What the DNA evidence adds to this picture is the ability to confirm a biological line when the paper record has gaps, which it does, because clerks made errors and courthouse fires consumed records and families moved across state lines and changed the spelling of names at the border, and sometimes simply never applied for the pension they were owed. The genealogical work is slow, it is specific, and it rewards the kind of sustained attention that treats a single census entry as evidence rather than as background noise. But the record is there. What the 15 surnames on this list carry is not a guarantee of Patriot ancestry. What they carry is a documented reason to look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.